I still remember the look on Daniel's face when he called me into his office that morning. It wasn't anger or even frustration. It was pure, calculated indifference. The kind reserved for things you're about to discard without a second thought. I had been with Westfield Technologies for nearly 9 years, working my way from junior analyst to director of operations, transforming our supply chain management from an industry joke to a case study taught in business schools. None of that mattered to Daniel Crawford, our newly appointed Chief Strategy Officer, and, more importantly, CEO Richard Crawford's favorite nephew. "Rebecca, please close the door," Daniel said, not bothering to look up from his computer. His desk was suspiciously clean for someone who had been with the company just 3 months. No family photos, no coffee mug rings, no scattered papers showing actual work being done. Just an expensive fountain pen perfectly aligned with an untouched leather notebook. I sat down across from him, the chair suddenly feeling unnaturally low. Later, I would realize he had deliberately adjusted the visitor's chair to ensure he'd be looking down at whoever sat there. A small, petty power play that perfectly encapsulated who Daniel was. "I've been reviewing the organizational structure," he began, his voice carrying that distinct MBA cadence that mistook using 10 words for what could be said in 3 as intelligence. "And I've determined that the operations division is unnecessarily top-heavy." I kept my expression neutral despite the alarm bells ringing in my head. Just last quarter, I had presented our division's record-breaking efficiency metrics to the board. We had reduced costs by 18% while increasing output by 22%, numbers that had directly contributed to our stock jumping 15 points in a single day. "Top-heavy?" I repeated carefully. "We're running the leanest operation in the company's history with the strongest results we've ever posted." Daniel's mouth twitched slightly, the first sign that my words had registered at all. "Numbers can be made to tell any story, Rebecca. I'm looking beyond quarterly reports to long-term structural integrity." It took considerable effort not to laugh at the buzzword salad he was serving. This was the same man who, 3 weeks earlier, had proposed we revolutionize our digital footprint through synergistic blockchain integration, without being able to explain what blockchain actually was when questioned by our CTO. "I see," I said, folding my hands in my lap. "And what changes are you proposing?" He finally looked up, making deliberate eye contact. "Effective immediately, operations will be divided into 3 specialized teams: logistics, procurement, and quality control. Each will report directly to me, eliminating the need for your current position." The air seemed to vanish from the room. "You're eliminating the director of operations role? Who will coordinate between these teams?" "I will, of course," Daniel replied with the confidence of someone who had never actually coordinated anything more complex than a lunch order. "This will streamline decision-making and reduce bureaucratic bottlenecks." The irony was suffocating. 3 weeks ago, I had sent an email to Richard, the CEO, expressing concerns about Daniel's proposed reorganization of our international shipping protocols, a plan that would have created exactly those bureaucratic bottlenecks he was now pretending to solve. My email had been professional but direct, outlining how Daniel's plan revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of our operations. I had suggested that perhaps he needed more time to understand our systems before proposing major changes. Richard had never responded. Now I understood why. "And my role in this new structure?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We value your experience," Daniel said, sliding a folder across his immaculate desk, "which is why we're offering you the position of Quality Control Manager, reporting to me. The compensation package has been adjusted accordingly, of course." I opened the folder to find a demotion dressed up as a lateral specialization. My salary would be cut by 40%, my team reduced from 28 to 7, and my office, well, I wouldn't have one anymore. I'd be moving to a workstation in the open floor plan. 9 years of building something exceptional, reduced to this. I closed the folder slowly, buying time to master the fury building inside me. "When does this reorganization take effect?" "Immediately," Daniel said, already turning back to his computer. "HR has the paperwork ready. They're expecting you now to process the transition. Your new workspace is being prepared as we speak. I stood up, folder in hand. And if I decline this new position? Daniel looked momentarily confused, as if the possibility hadn't occurred to him. Then standard severance would apply. 2 weeks for each year of service. He shrugged slightly. Your choice, of course. I nodded, maintaining a calm I didn't feel. I'll need time to consider this. Of course, he said, his attention already elsewhere. Please let HR know your decision by the end of day. I walked out of his office with my head high, past his assistant who couldn't quite meet my eyes, through the executive suite where whispers followed me like shadows. By the time I reached the operations floor, my floor, the news had somehow traveled faster than I had. My team watched me cross the room, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. Michael, my logistics manager and right hand for the past 5 years, intercepted me before I reached my office. Is it true? He asked quietly. Conference room, I replied. 5 minutes. Bring the senior team. Inside my office, I closed the door and took exactly 30 seconds to process what had just happened. Breathing deeply, I looked around at the space I had occupied for the past 4 years. Awards lined the walls. Industry recognitions, not vanity pieces. Framed photos from team celebrations marked milestones that had transformed the company's fortunes. On my desk sat a small crystal paperweight the team had given me last Christmas, engraved with our unofficial motto, "Make it work, then make it better." I gathered a few personal items into my bag, leaving the awards and recognitions. Those belonged to the team, not to me. In the conference room, 7 anxious faces waited. My senior managers, the backbone of our division, each handpicked and mentored over the years. I didn't sugarcoat it. Operations is being split into 3 divisions, all reporting directly to Daniel. The director position is being eliminated. I've been offered quality control manager, effectively a demotion with a significant pay cut. Stunned silence followed, then a barrage of questions and protests. I let them vent for a few minutes before raising my hand. This decision has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with politics, I said calmly. Daniel wants his own people in key positions, and I made the mistake of questioning his judgment 3 weeks ago. The shipping protocols email? Michael asked, realization dawning. You were right about that. His plan would have been a disaster. Being right doesn't always matter in corporate politics, I replied. I haven't decided yet whether I'm taking the new position or the severance package, but regardless, I wanted you all to hear it from me first. Sarah, my procurement specialist, leaned forward. What happens to the Miller contract? We're finalizing next week, and they specifically requested you oversee the implementation. That was the question I'd been dreading. The Miller contract was potentially the largest in our company's history, a 5-year agreement worth over $200 million. I had personally cultivated the relationship for 3 years, and the final signing was scheduled for next Thursday. Daniel will presumably handle it now, I said, the words tasting bitter. Rebecca, Michael said slowly, Daniel doesn't even understand our current supply chain architecture. The Miller implementation requires integrating their legacy systems with our new platform. It took you months to design that integration. I'm aware, I replied, keeping my voice level. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about me anymore. The Miller contract could make or break the company's fiscal year, and Daniel was about to blunder into the final negotiations with no understanding of the technical complexities involved. What are you going to do? Asked Trent, my youngest manager. I gathered my thoughts, considering my options carefully. First, I'm going to speak with HR. Then I'm going to make a decision that I can live with, not just tomorrow, but 5 years from now. After dismissing the team, I walked to HR where Paula, the director I'd known for 7 years, waited with uncomfortable sympathy. I'm so sorry, Rebecca, she said, closing her office door. This wasn't my decision. I know, I replied. Did Richard sign off on this reorganization? She hesitated. The board approved Daniel's strategic realignment proposal yesterday. Richard presented it. So the CEO had fully backed his nephew's play. No surprise there. Paula, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer, I said. Is there anything in my employment contract that specifically designates me as the point person for the Miller implementation? She frowned, pulling up my file on her computer. Let me check. Yes, actually. The proposal that Miller approved specifically names you as the implementation lead. It's in the preliminary agreement they signed in February. I felt a small flutter of vindication. And that preliminary agreement is binding until the final contract is signed? Yes, she confirmed. Any material changes would require their approval. I nodded slowly. Thank you. That's very helpful. Rebecca, Paula said cautiously. Whatever you're thinking, be careful. Daniel has Richard's full support. I'm not going to do anything rash, I assured her. I just need to understand my position before I make a decision. Back in my soon-to-be former office, I carefully reviewed my options. I could accept the demotion, swallow my pride, and try to work under Daniel's misguided leadership. I could take the severance package and walk away from 9 years of building something I was truly proud of. Or there was a third option, riskier, but potentially the only way to protect both my team and the company from Daniel's incompetence. At 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes before HR's deadline for my decision, I sent a carefully worded email to Daniel with Richard copied. Daniel, after careful consideration, I am declining the position of Quality Control Manager. However, before finalizing my departure, I want to bring to your attention an urgent contractual matter regarding the Miller implementation. As you may not be aware, the preliminary agreement signed in February specifically names me as the implementation lead. Section 7.3 states that any material changes to the implementation team must be approved by Miller in writing. Their legal team was particularly insistent on this point given their past experiences with vendor transitions. To ensure a smooth handover and avoid any potential complications with the Miller signing next week, I would be willing to stay on as a consultant specifically for this project, working alongside whoever you designate as my replacement. This would provide continuity for the client while allowing your reorganization to proceed. Please let me know your thoughts on this proposal by tomorrow morning, as I will need to inform Miller of any changes to the implementation team as per our agreement. Regards, Rebecca Winters, Director of Operations. I hit send, then leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. It was a calculated move. If Daniel had any sense, he would recognize the lifeline I was offering. The Miller contract was too important to risk, and this would give him a face-saving way to keep me involved while still proceeding with his reorganization. But I had seen enough of Daniel to know that sense wasn't his strong suit. Pride was. My phone rang less than 5 minutes later. Not Daniel, but Richard himself. Rebecca, he said, his voice carrying that forced joviality he used when conducting difficult business. I just saw your email to Daniel. I appreciate your concern for the Miller contract. It's a significant commitment for the company, I replied neutrally. I want to ensure its success. Yes, well, that's commendable. However, I think there's some confusion about the reorganization. Daniel has been working closely with me on this strategic shift for weeks. He's quite familiar with all our major accounts, including Miller. I bit back a laugh. Daniel could barely find the Miller file, let alone understand the technical integration challenges we'd spent months solving. With all due respect, Richard, the Miller implementation involves proprietary systems integration that took my team months to design. It's not something that can be understood from reading reports. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him weighing his options. What exactly are you proposing? He asked finally. Simple. I'll stay on as a consultant for the Miller implementation only. 8 weeks, my current salary prorated for that period. I'll work with whoever Daniel assigns to take over, ensuring a smooth transition. After that, I'll exit quietly with the standard severance package. Another long pause. And if we decline? Then I'll be obligated to inform Miller of the change in implementation leadership, as required by our preliminary agreement. Given how specific they were about having me lead this process, I can't predict how they'll react. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact, but from Richard's sharp intake of breath, I knew he understood the implications. Miller could walk away, taking $200 million with them. Let me discuss this with Daniel, he said finally. I'll get back to you first thing tomorrow. I didn't hear anything that evening. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, I arrived at the office to find my security badge still active, a promising sign. My office, however, was already being emptied. My name removed from the door. Message received. I set up temporarily in a small conference room, working on contingency plans for the Miller implementation, regardless of Richard's decision. At 9:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Emergency exec meeting called. 9:30. Something about Miller. At 10:45 my phone rang. Richard again. Rebecca, he said without preamble, I'd like you to join me in the boardroom. The executive floor was unusually quiet when I arrived. Richard's assistant waved me directly into the boardroom where I found Richard alone, standing at the window overlooking the city. Close the door, please, he said without turning around. I did, then waited silently. Whatever was coming, I wouldn't make it easier by speaking first. Miller called this morning, he said finally, turning to face me. Apparently someone informed them about our reorganization. They're concerned about changes to the implementation team. I kept my expression neutral. I haven't spoken to anyone at Miller. I didn't say you did, Richard replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Nevertheless, they're insisting on meeting today to discuss the situation. They specifically requested your presence. Now I understood the emergency executive meeting. I see. And what did you tell them? That of course you would be there, Richard said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Which presents us with a dilemma. Not really, I replied calmly. My consultant proposal still stands. 8 weeks, current salary, clean transition, quiet exit, everyone saves face. Richard studied me for a long moment. And Daniel's role in this? Will be unchanged. He'll lead operations in its new structure. I'll simply ensure the Miller implementation proceeds as planned, reporting to him as agreed in the original proposal. Another long pause as Richard considered his options. We both knew they were limited. Fine, he said finally, but the consultant period is 4 weeks, not 8. And I want your word that you won't undermine Daniel's authority during this transition. 4 weeks isn't enough for proper knowledge transfer on a project this complex, I countered. 6 weeks and you have my word that my only focus will be the Miller implementation. I won't interfere with Daniel's reorganization. Richard nodded reluctantly. Draw up the terms and have them on my desk before the Miller meeting. We present a united front to the client, understood? Completely, I agreed. The Miller meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. At 1:30, I submitted the consulting agreement to Richard, who signed it without comment. Daniel was conspicuously absent from the preparations, though I later learned he had argued vehemently against my continued involvement. The meeting itself went surprisingly well. I assured the Miller team that the reorganization wouldn't affect their implementation timeline and that I would personally oversee the integration as originally planned. Their relief was palpable, and by the end, the crisis had been averted. The contract signing remained on schedule for the following Thursday. As we walked the Miller team out, Richard pulled me aside. Well handled, he admitted grudgingly. But don't mistake this for a victory, Rebecca. When the 6 weeks are up, you're out. I smiled politely. I understand completely. 6 weeks, clean transition, quiet exit. As agreed. The next morning, I moved into a small temporary office near the operations floor. My team was understandably confused by my new consultant status, but I assured them it was a mutual decision to ensure the Miller implementation succeeded. Daniel, meanwhile, wasted no time asserting his authority over the newly fragmented operations division. He scheduled daily status meetings, demanded unnecessary reports, and generally made everyone's work more difficult while contributing nothing of value. But true to my word, I focused solely on the Miller implementation, meticulously documenting every process, creating detailed transition plans, and training the team that would eventually take over. What I didn't tell anyone was that I was also carefully documenting something else. Every flawed decision Daniel made, every process he broke, every efficiency metric that began to slip under his leadership. Not for revenge, but for insurance. The Miller contract was signed on schedule the following Thursday. It should have been a triumph for the company. Our largest deal ever, the culmination of years of relationship building and technical innovation. Instead, it was treated almost as an afterthought, Daniel took credit in the company-wide announcement, with only a brief mention of the implementation team that had made it possible. I said nothing. I simply continued my work, counting down the days of my consulting agreement. 3 weeks into my 6-week consultancy, the first cracks in Daniel's leadership began to show. A major shipment to our second-largest client was delayed because Daniel had changed the approval process without understanding the dependencies involved. Cost overruns appeared in departments that had previously been models of efficiency. Team members began to resign, first 1 or 2, then a concerning trickle. Michael kept me informed of the deteriorating situation, though I was careful never to comment or interfere. I simply listened and continued focusing on the Miller implementation. At the 4-week mark, disaster struck. A critical software update that Daniel had insisted on pushing ahead, despite warnings from the IT department, caused a system-wide failure in our inventory management system. For 26 hours, we were effectively blind to our entire supply chain. Emergency teams worked around the clock to implement a rollback, but the damage was done. We missed shipments to 14 major clients, incurring penalty clauses and damaging relationships built over years. The next morning, Richard called me to his office. "I need your assessment of the system failure," he said without preamble, the dark circles under his eyes testifying to a sleepless night. I chose my words carefully. "The technical team has already identified the root cause. The update wasn't properly tested in our integration environment before deployment." "I know the technical cause," Richard snapped. "I want to know how this happened organizationally. This kind of mistake never occurred under your leadership." It was the opening I had been waiting for, but I didn't rush in. Under the previous structure, we had checks and balances in place. Major changes required sign-off from multiple stakeholders who understood the potential impacts across the entire operation. That system appears to have been changed. Richard's expression darkened. "By Daniel." I didn't need to confirm what he already knew. "I can't speak to the current decision-making process. I've been focused solely on the Miller implementation, as agreed." He studied me for a long moment. "The Miller integration is proceeding on schedule?" "Yes," I replied. "We're ahead of projections, actually. Their system is responding well to our integration architecture." "At least something is working," Richard muttered. "I need you to do something for me, Rebecca. Unofficially." I waited silently. "Prepare a report. An honest assessment of operations since the reorganization. Data, not opinions. I want it by tomorrow morning, and I want it confidential." "That wasn't part of our consulting agreement," I pointed out. "Consider it a personal favor," Richard said. "One that won't be forgotten when your agreement ends." I nodded slowly. "I'll need access to all operational data from the past month." "You'll have it within the hour." I spent that night in my temporary office, though in truth, not much work was needed. The report I delivered to Richard the next morning was largely compiled from the documentation I had been meticulously keeping since my demotion. 14 pages of hard data showing declining performance metrics across every division Daniel now controlled. Increased costs, delayed shipments, rising error rates, customer complaints, and staff turnover. The numbers told a devastating story of incompetence and mismanagement. Richard received the report without comment. I didn't hear anything for 2 days. Then, early Friday morning, another summons to the executive floor. This time, the boardroom was full. The entire executive team sat around the table, along with 2 members of the board I recognized. Daniel sat rigidly at Richard's right hand, his face an alarming shade of red. Richard gestured for me to sit. "Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. We've been discussing the recent operational challenges, and your report has been illuminating." Daniel couldn't contain himself. "This is a hit job. She's deliberately sabotaged operations to make me look bad." "By documenting factual performance metrics?" I asked mildly. "Enough," Richard cut in. "The numbers speak for themselves. In the months since the reorganization, we've seen a 23% drop in on-time deliveries, a 31% increase in operational costs, and we've lost 7 key staff members. The only bright spot is the Miller implementation, which remains on schedule." He turned to face his nephew. "Daniel, the board has lost confidence in your leadership of operations. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to business development." A demotion wrapped in a fancy title. Exactly what Daniel had tried to do to me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Daniel's face contorted with rage. This is her fault. She's been undermining me from day one. Rebecca has done exactly what we asked her to do, Richard replied coldly. Focus on the Miller implementation and nothing else. The failures in operations are entirely the result of your reorganization and leadership. Daniel looked around the room for support but found none. So that's it? She wins? Richard sighed heavily. This isn't about winning or losing, Daniel. It's about what's best for the company. He turned to me. Rebecca, in light of these developments, we'd like to offer you a new position. Executive Vice President of Operations and Supply Chain Management. You would report directly to me, with full authority to rebuild the division as you see fit. The room fell silent, all eyes on me. It was more than a restoration. It was a promotion 2 levels up the corporate ladder, leapfrogging over Daniel and placing me in the executive suite. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully. But I need to be clear about something first. If I accept, there can't be any behind-the-scenes interference, no matter who it comes from. I need full autonomy to rebuild what's been broken. Richard understood my meaning perfectly. The board has granted complete operational authority to this position, no exceptions. I nodded slowly. Then I accept. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is bullshit. She planned this from the beginning. Daniel! Richard's voice cracked like a whip. That's enough. The decision is made. Report to Janet in business development on Monday. After a moment of tense silence, Daniel stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Richard turned back to me. I apologize for that. Family complicates business sometimes. It does, I agreed. Which is why clear boundaries are essential. The message wasn't subtle. No more nepotism, no more undermining my authority. Richard nodded once, acknowledging the new reality. When can you start? He asked. I never stopped, I replied simply. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity as I reassembled the operations division, bringing back key team members who had left and reestablishing the processes that had made us successful. The Miller implementation continued smoothly, now just one of many priorities under my expanded authority. Daniel avoided me entirely, which was fine. He lasted 6 months in business development before leaving to join a startup founded by one of his business school classmates. The company announcement wished him well in his entrepreneurial pursuits. No one was surprised. On the anniversary of my almost demotion, my team organized a small celebration in the operations center. Michael presented me with a new crystal paperweight, larger than the previous one, engraved with a slightly modified version of our motto, "Make it work, make it better, make it last." As I looked around at the team, my team, I realized that what had felt like an ending a year ago had actually been a beginning. Not just for me, but for all of us who had refused to accept that competence and integrity were less important than connections and titles. Later that evening, alone in my executive office, I took out the consulting agreement I had signed a year earlier. 6 weeks, clean transition, quiet exit. I smiled as I filed it away in my personal archives. A reminder that sometimes, the long game is the only one worth playing. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply being too valuable to lose.